Alright, so the purpose of this test is to test the media server capabilities of this RAID enclosure. And to do this test, I'll be using this router, the TP-Link AC2300 router. And the key feature that we need is this thing right here. There's a media sharing capabilities that will allow you to stream this hard drive to any other computer that's connected to, and it's currently plugged into the USB 3.0 port, but there's also a USB 2.0 port that we're not going to be using. And I wanted this to be a real world test, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go upstairs, because right now I'm trying to simulate what it would be like to be streaming movies or music from another room, because you're most likely not going to be streaming from right in front of the router. So I'm just going up to another floor, going through one door and going into my room, and here we are. And I'm going to be using this laptop to start streaming it. So again, I'm going to be using Crystal Disk to test it, and you can actually test network locations by clicking on here, clicking select folder. Now if I click network, you'll actually see C2300 share, and that's actually the router that I have downstairs. So I'm just gonna click on this volume, and I'm actually gonna lower this to a smaller size, and I'm just gonna start the test. And now I'm not gonna go into how you set up a media share. That could be for another video, but all you need to know right now is I've got the hard drive connected over the network basically, and that's all handled by the router and by Windows, and there's actually not much you can do about it. So all of the drivers and things like that, it's optimized pretty well because you can't really change any of it. It's all handled by driver level things. So while we're waiting for that test to go by, I want to talk about these other benchmarks we got here. So first, we're seeing right here is this is the hard drive by itself. This is the RAID 1 hard drive, and again, I'll just go over what we saw earlier. We see that the RAID 1 performance is actually worse than the actually, no, that's the wrong one. Let me actually bring up the right RAID 1, which is this one right here. This is the right RAID 1. Okay, so this is the right RAID 1 performance, where we saw that the read performance doesn't really get helped in any way, and we see the write performance actually gets worse. Yeah, this has something to do with the software RAID again, and we're still waiting for it, which is actually going kind of slowly. Not a good sign. What it means is that the network performance is pretty slow. Just for reference, we're doing this one floor up from the router. It's using USB 3.0, and it's running on 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi. You could do this on 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi, but what I've actually found is that the 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi works a lot faster than the 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi. So what we saw there is pretty bad performance there, and that's to be expected given that we're upstairs using 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi. And one thing that's actually a big stress is this is actually a 1 gigabyte file transfer. So a lot of the times when you do a large file transfer over the network, what happens is you start to drop packets, and you have to request packets again, and that's one of the reasons why having a large file transfer over the network is usually not a good idea, just because it's really hard to successfully transfer the whole thing without having an error. So a lot of the bandwidth is wasted in trying to send the file without having much errors. One thing I also want to compare to is, actually, you might be thinking to yourself, hey, what if I didn't get this RAID enclosure and I wanted to plug in the SSD as my network, as my media server? So I've actually got the benchmarks for directly plugging in the SSD, which of course has much better performance than the SSD has much better performance than the hard drive. But one thing you'll notice here is that when you plug this is actually the SSD plugged over Wi-Fi. You'll actually notice that over Wi-Fi the SSD gets much weaker. You'll see this here, and the reason why that is because even though your SSD is really fast, Wi-Fi is the limiting factor here, because you can't transfer that much files over Wi-Fi. It's limited to, well, the theoretical limit is pretty high. I think it's I think my router said something like 1700 megabits, which comes out to 200 megabytes or something like that. But these are all theoretical limits, so we see the real world number is more like, I don't know, 40 to 70 megabytes per second when you're transferring that file over Wi-Fi. And just for reference, I've actually got, okay, so here, right here this is what happens when you transfer that file over Ethernet. So when you give yourself a direct wired connection over a standard RJ35 copper Ethernet cable, you actually see you get pretty big boost in performance. So this is the Wi-Fi 5 gigahertz versus the Ethernet performance, and you see that you get quite a bit of gains just by switching to the wired Ethernet connection for those of you who are going to use this this RAID enclosure over Ethernet versus over Wi-Fi. You'll see that there is a pretty significant performance gain. However, these gains are the SSD, and the purpose of this review is to actually test this RAID enclosure. So we're getting towards the end of the test, and one of the things we'll notice is that yeah, we got pretty bad performance on the sequentials, and again, this has largely to do with the massive file size, because when you try to transfer a large file, it starts to drop things. One of the things you'll notice here is that you might notice, why are the multi-threaded things actually better in performance? Because usually you would expect the multi-threaded to actually drop the performance, and I think what's going on here is it's actually a flaw with the software that's testing it. I think the benchmarking start and stop times get kind of messed up when you try to do multi-threaded accesses over Wi-Fi. So I don't think it's, so you might be thinking, hey, I just improved my performance of the multi-threaded deep quays by switching it to the Wi-Fi, but I think that's actually just a bug with the software. So it's actually hard to say what's exactly going on, and you might even see that the random accesses got faster, which in theory it doesn't make sense that random accesses over Wi-Fi will be faster. If anything, random access over Wi-Fi should be significantly slower, but again, I think this is just a bug with the software. So now I'm actually gonna take this. Well, this review is going kind of long, so I'm actually gonna cut it short here, and I'm actually gonna do direct connections, and I'm gonna stand right next to the router as another test. So this concludes the real world performance test.